Hey there, night wanderers. Welcome to The Sleepy Activist, where we uncover the hidden stories of resistance, solidarity, and collective power that changed the world one restful night at a time. Tonight we're settling into the darkest nights, not metaphorically, but literally. Nights when the sun disappeared behind walls of dust, when farmers couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces, when the earth itself seemed to be rising up to drive people from their homes. We're walking alongside the farmers and families who endured the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, that ecological and human disaster that transformed the Great Plains and forced the largest migration in American history. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy easing into sleep through stories like this. Drop a comment below and let us know where and when you're watching. Are you safe in bed while storms rage outside, listening in the quiet hours when the air is still? Or maybe you're somewhere far away, understanding what it means when the environment itself becomes hostile. Tonight's story isn't about government programs or agricultural statistics. It's about ordinary families who watch their farms blow away, who stuffed rags in every crack to keep out the dust, who migrated west with everything they owned tied to their cars, who built new communities in labor camps and migrant towns. It's about ecological disaster caused by human choices, about resilience in the face of catastrophe, and about how environmental crisis and economic collapse combine to create suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. So, let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax, and let's travel back to 1932 to a small farm in the Oklahoma Panhandle, where a young farmer named John and his wife Mary are about to experience the first of the great dust storms, the beginning of a decade that will test every ounce of their strength and determination. John is 28 years old in 1932, third generation on his family's farm in the Oklahoma Panhandle. His grandfather homesteaded this land in the 1890s, breaking the prairie sod to plant wheat. His father expanded the farm during the boom years of World War I, when wheat prices soared and rain seemed plentiful. John inherited 200 acres of what once was shortgrass prairie, now converted entirely to wheat production. The land in 1932 still looks productive, though anyone paying attention might notice worrying signs. The native grasses that once held the soil in place are long gone, ploughed under for wheat. The soil, exposed during the fallow season between crops, lies bare to the wind. The weather has been drier than usual for a few years, but that seems like normal variation, nothing to truly worry about. John and Mary have been married for 5 years. They have 2 children, a daughter of 4 and a son of 2. They live in a simple wooden farmhouse, painted white, though the paint is peeling, with a well that provides adequate water, a root cellar for food storage, and a barn for their 2 horses, 3 cows, chickens and pigs. By the standards of 1932, in the depths of the Depression, they're actually doing reasonably well. They produce much of their own food, they own their land outright with no mortgage, and they have a small cash income from wheat sales. But the land is changing in ways that aren't immediately visible. Decades of intensive wheat cultivation have depleted the soil's organic matter. The deep root systems of native prairie grasses that once held soil in place through droughts have been destroyed. The land has been ploughed to the very edges of properties, removing windbreaks and natural barriers. The entire ecosystem has been converted into a monoculture optimized for short-term profit, but fragile in the face of environmental stress. The drought that will trigger the Dust Bowl is already beginning. Rainfall in 1930 was below average. 1931 was worse. By 1932, the region is experiencing serious drought, though not yet catastrophic. Wheat crops are smaller but still viable. Wells are lower but still producing. Farmers discuss the dry spell but assume rain will return, as it always has before. They have no way of knowing they're at the beginning of the worst ecological disaster in American agricultural history. The economic context makes everything worse. The Depression has driven wheat prices to historic lows. Even when crops succeed, they barely cover costs. Many farmers are already in debt, mortgaging future crops for seed, equipment, and basic survival. Banks are foreclosing on farms across the region, though John's family, having no mortgage, is insulated from that particular disaster. The farming techniques of the era are extractive and unsustainable, though no one uses that language yet. Farmers ploughed deep, turning over as much soil as possible to maximize wheat production. They remove all native vegetation, seeing it as competition for their crops. They plant fence row to fence row, leaving no land fallow, no diversity, no resilience. The federal government and agricultural extension agents actively encouraged these practices during the boom years, praising farmers who maximized production. Mary keeps a garden that provides vegetables for the family. She cans hundreds of jars each summer: tomatoes, beans, pickles, preserves, food that will sustain them through winter. She tends the chickens, who provide eggs and occasional meat. She makes butter from their cow's milk. She sews and repairs all the family's clothing. Her labor, unpaid and largely invisible, is essential to the family's survival. John works from dawn till dark during planting and harvest seasons. He maintains equipment, tends animals, repairs buildings, and worries constantly about weather, prices, and the future. He's exhausted most of the time, worn down by physical labor and economic anxiety. But the farm is all he knows, all his family has ever known. The idea of doing anything else or of being anything other than a farmer is almost unthinkable. On a day in November 1932, John notices something strange. The sky to the north is darkening, but not like a normal storm. The darkness has a reddish-brown tint, and it's moving unusually fast. Birds are flying frantically away from it. The air has a strange electric feeling. Within minutes, the darkness engulfs the farm. It's not rain, it's dust.
The first major dust storm hits John's farm in late 1932, though historians will later identify the massive Black Sunday storm of April 14, 1935, as the most iconic. But for farmers on the ground, the terror begins earlier, with smaller storms that gradually increase in frequency and intensity. When that first big storm hits, John and Mary have perhaps 15 minutes of warning. They rush to get the children inside, to bring the animals into the barn, to shut every window and door. The storm, when it arrives, is unlike anything they've experienced. The dust is so thick it blocks out the sun completely. Visibility drops to zero. The wind howls, driving dust through every crack, every gap, every tiny opening in the house. Mary rushes around, stuffing wet rags into window frames, around doors, anywhere dust might enter. It doesn't matter. The dust finds its way in anyway, settling on every surface, getting into food, into water, into lungs. The children are terrified, crying, struggling to breathe through cloth held over their faces. The storm lasts for 3 hours, though it feels like an eternity. When it finally passes and they emerge, the world has changed. Everything is covered in a thick layer of fine brown dust. Drifts of dust have piled up like snow against buildings and fences, in some places several feet deep. The wheat field, what little remained after the dry summer, has been stripped bare, the topsoil blown away. Dead birds and rabbits lie scattered across the farmyard, suffocated by the dust. This is just the beginning. Through 1933 and 1934, the storms become more frequent and more severe. Sometimes there are multiple storms in a single week. The dust doesn't just come during storms. On calm days, it hangs in the air, reducing visibility, coating everything, making every breath difficult. People develop dust pneumonia, a condition where their lungs fill with fine particles, leading to chronic coughing, difficulty breathing, and in severe cases, death. Mary's daily routine becomes an exhausting battle against dust. She sweeps and wipes continuously, but within hours, everything is coated again. She hangs wet sheets over windows, trying to catch dust before it enters. She covers food immediately after preparing it, and still finds dust in every meal. She watches her children develop the chronic cough that afflicts nearly everyone in the region. She does laundry constantly, trying to keep clothes clean enough to wear, using precious water to rinse dust from fabric. The children's health deteriorates. They're frequently sick, struggling to breathe, losing weight because even eating becomes difficult when food is always gritty with dust. The local doctor, overwhelmed with patients suffering from dust-related illness, can do little beyond advising people to stay inside during storms and keep cloth over their faces. Some children die from dust pneumonia, their small lungs unable to cope with the constant assault. The animals suffer terribly. Cattle and horses caught outside during storms sometimes suffocate, their nostrils and throats clogged with dust. Those that survive become weak and malnourished as vegetation disappears. John watches his livestock deteriorate, unable to provide adequate food or shelter for all of them. He eventually has to make the heartbreaking decision to slaughter some animals before they die from starvation, though he has no market to sell the meat and barely enough for his family. The psychological toll is enormous. The storms are unpredictable, striking with little warning, day or night. People live in constant anxiety, watching the horizon for signs of approaching dust clouds. The darkness during storms, complete and disorienting, triggers primal fears. Some people have mental breakdowns, unable to cope with the relentless environmental assault. Suicide rates in the Dust Bowl region increase significantly during the worst years. The economic situation compounds the environmental disaster. With crops failing repeatedly, farmers have no income. They can't pay for supplies, can't afford seed for the next planting, can't maintain equipment. Those with mortgages face foreclosure. Even John's family, without debt, struggles as their savings disappear and they're reduced to pure subsistence, producing just enough food to survive with nothing left to sell. Government response initially is minimal. President Hoover's administration, ideologically opposed to federal intervention, offers little help. Local charities are overwhelmed. Churches try to organize relief, but they're operating in communities where almost everyone is suffering. The Red Cross distributes some food and supplies, but it's nowhere near adequate to the scale of the disaster. By 1934, the situation is catastrophic. That year sees the worst drought conditions on record. Temperatures soar above 110 degrees for weeks at a time. What little vegetation survived previous years dies completely. The land becomes a desert. Dust storms occur with such frequency that people measure clear days rather than dust days. The entire region seems to be dying. John faces a decision he never imagined he'd have to make. Stay on the land that's been in his family for 3 generations, hoping somehow conditions will improve, gambling his family's lives on the possibility that rain will return, or abandon the farm, join the thousands of families already fleeing the Dust Bowl, and try to start over somewhere else with no money, no prospects, and no guarantee of anything better.
John decides to stay, at least for now. He can't bear the thought of abandoning the land his grandfather broke, the farm his father built, everything his family has ever known. Mary supports the decision, though she's terrified for the children's health. They'll endure 1 more year, try 1 more planting, hope that 1935 brings the rain they desperately need. The decision to stay requires developing survival strategies that previous generations never needed. John learns to read the dust storms, to recognize the signs of an approaching black blizzard, and get everyone to safety. He builds better seals around doors and windows. He digs trenches to divert dust drifts away from the house. He slaughters most of their livestock, keeping only what they absolutely need, because he can't feed them and can't watch them starve. Mary becomes expert at cooking and preserving food in dust-contaminated conditions. She learns to cover everything immediately, to rinse vegetables multiple times, to strain drinking water through cloth. She keeps the children inside as much as possible during the worst dust days, though they're restless and cabin fever becomes a serious problem. She makes them cloth masks to wear, dampened to filter dust, though the children hate them. The community develops collective survival strategies. Neighbors who haven't already left share resources, information, and emotional support. They warn each other when storms approach. They share food when one family has a little extra. They take turns traveling to town for supplies, so not everyone has to make the difficult journey. They hold services and gatherings that maintain social bonds and provide psychological relief from the constant stress. But the community is shrinking. Every week, another family gives up and leaves. John watches his neighbors pack everything they can fit into or onto their cars and drive away, heading west toward California, where rumors say there are jobs in agriculture, where rain still falls, where life might be possible. Each departure makes the community weaker, makes those who remain more isolated, makes the future seem more uncertain. The famous Black Sunday storm of April 14, 1935, is the worst John and Mary experience. It arrives late afternoon, a massive wall of dust, thousands of feet high, rolling across the plains with terrifying speed.
The darkness when it hits is complete. John literally cannot see his hand in front of his face. The family huddles in their small interior room, praying, struggling to breathe despite wet cloths over their faces, listening to the wind howl and the house creak under the pressure. When that storm finally passes, the psychological impact is as devastating as the physical damage. This isn't just bad weather that will pass. This is the land itself becoming uninhabitable. The ecosystem has collapsed. The soil that took thousands of years to form is blowing away in hours. The dream of agricultural prosperity that drew settlers to the Great Plains has turned into a nightmare. Still, John tries to continue farming. In spring 1935, he plants wheat one more time, using the last of his seed and the last of his savings. Maybe this will be the year the rain returns. Maybe somehow the land will recover. Maybe giving up on 3 generations of family history isn't necessary. The wheat sprouts, small green shoots emerging from the dust-covered ground. For a few weeks there's hope. Then the lack of rain continues. The wheat withers and dies. The dust storms continue. By summer it's clear there will be no harvest, no income, no way to continue as they have been. The federal government finally begins responding more aggressively. The newly created Soil Conservation Service sends agents to farmers about erosion prevention, about sustainable agriculture practices, about the mistakes that led to this disaster. But the advice, however sound, comes too late for many farmers. You can't implement soil conservation practices when you have no resources, when you're barely surviving, when the land has already blown away. The government also begins buying drought-stricken cattle to reduce suffering and provide farmers with some income. John sells his remaining cattle to government agents for a fraction of what they would have been worth in normal times. The money helps, but it's not enough to save the farm. It's enough to survive a little longer, to postpone the inevitable decision. Mary's health deteriorates from constant exposure to dust. She develops a chronic cough that won't go away, painful breathing, exhaustion that no amount of rest relieves. She's not alone. Dust pneumonia affects thousands across the region, killing hundreds. The local doctor, himself suffering from dust-related illness, can only advise her to rest, to avoid exertion, to somehow stay away from the dust that's everywhere, always. By late 1935, the situation is untenable. The farm is producing nothing, savings are gone, health is failing. The community has shrunk to a fraction of its previous size. The schools are half empty or closing entirely. The local church holds services for 12 people instead of hundreds. The town's businesses are shuttered. The entire social fabric is unraveling. John and Mary have the conversation they've been avoiding. They have to leave. They have to join the migration west. They have to abandon the farm, the land, everything their family built, and try to start over somewhere else. The decision, when it finally comes, brings both grief and relief. Grief for what's lost, for the failure to maintain the family legacy, for the severing of generations of connection to place. Relief that the constant struggle might end, that there might be possibility somewhere else, that the children might have a chance to grow up healthy.
In early 1936, John and Mary pack everything they can fit into and onto their aging Model T Ford. Furniture has to be left behind or sold for almost nothing to the few remaining neighbours. Clothes, tools, a few precious family items. That's all they can take. They have approximately $40 in cash, the last remnant of the cattle sale. With that, they'll drive 2,000 miles to California, hoping to find work, hoping to find a future. They're not alone. By 1936, the migration from the Dust Bowl is in full swing. Approximately 2.5 million people will eventually leave the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl years, with perhaps 400,000 heading to California. They become known as Okies, a term that starts as geographical description but becomes a slur, marking them as poor, desperate, unwanted migrants. The journey west is its own kind of ordeal. Route 66, the main migration route, becomes crowded with overloaded vehicles, many breaking down, some abandoned by the roadside. Families camp wherever they can, often with no facilities, no shelter, no resources. Towns along the route view the migrants with suspicion and hostility, seeing them as potential burdens, as competitors for scarce jobs, as threats to local communities. John's car breaks down repeatedly. Each repair consumes precious cash they can't spare. They eat as little as possible to conserve money. The children are hungry constantly, asking questions their parents can't answer. Where are we going? When will we get there? Why did we leave home? Mary tries to maintain normalcy, singing songs, playing games, telling stories, but the strain shows in her face, in her cough that's getting worse, in her exhaustion. They encounter other migrant families at roadside camps, and these temporary communities become sources of information and support. Migrants share knowledge about which routes are passable, which towns are hostile, where there might be work. They share food when they can, watch each other's children, provide emotional support. These bonds, formed in shared desperation, are often stronger than relationships back home ever were. The hostility they encounter is shocking and hurtful. Towns post signs warning Okies keep moving, no work here. Police at city borders turn migrants away, sometimes violently, claiming they're protecting communities from disease and poverty. Local residents view the migrants with contempt, seeing them as ignorant farmers who destroyed their own land and now want to burden others with their problems. This treatment is eye-opening for John and Mary. They've never been seen as less than, as undesirable, as problems to be solved. They're farmers, respectable people, hard workers. But to the communities they pass through, they're just poor migrants, barely distinguishable from vagrants, not fully deserving of basic human dignity. The experience teaches them something about class, about how quickly social status can change, and about how people are treated when they have nothing. After 3 weeks on the road, often making only 30 or 40 miles per day, as the car struggles with the load and the deteriorating roads, they finally reach California's Central Valley. The landscape is a shock after years in the Dust Bowl. Everything is green, irrigated, productive. Orchards and fields stretch to the horizon.
Water flows in irrigation ditches. The air is clear. For a moment, it seems like they've reached paradise. That illusion doesn't last long. They quickly discover that thousands of other migrants have had the same idea, and the agricultural work they hoped for is nowhere near adequate to employ everyone. The farms are hiring, but they're paying wages so low that a family can barely survive even working full-time. The famous labor contractor system means farmers don't hire directly, but use middlemen who take a cut of already minimal wages. John and Mary end up in a migrant labor camp, essentially a shanty town where farm workers live in tents, makeshift shacks, or in their cars. There's a communal water tap, minimal sanitation, no electricity. Hundreds of families are crammed into a few acres. The conditions are worse than anything they experienced on the farm, even during the worst dust storms. At least at home, they had a house, privacy, dignity. But they have no choice. John takes any agricultural work he can find, picking cotton, harvesting fruit, anything. The work is backbreaking, the hours long, the pay minimal. Mary can't work in the fields because of her respiratory problems from dust pneumonia, so she tries to maintain their camp, to care for the children, to make their tent feel like a home. The children, now 6 and 4, should be in school, but there's no school accessible to migrant children. The camp becomes its own community. Migrants from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and other Dust Bowl states share stories, resources, and survival strategies. They organize informal schools for children. They share childcare so parents can work. They pool resources for food. They maintain social structures and mutual aid despite appalling living conditions. This solidarity is their main tool for survival in a hostile environment. John witnesses the labor organizing that's beginning among agricultural workers. He attends meetings where union organizers talk about strikes, about collective bargaining, about demanding better wages and conditions. He's sympathetic but also fearful. They're so vulnerable, so easily replaced, so dependent on any work they can get. Still, he sees the logic. If all the workers stand together, the growers can't play them off each other, can't keep wages at starvation levels.
The years 1936 through 1939 are a grinding struggle for survival in California's agricultural regions. John and Mary move from camp to camp, following crops, taking any work available, saving whatever small amount they can. Mary's health never fully recovers from the dust pneumonia, and the hard living conditions in migrant camps make it worse. The children grow up in poverty that's worse in some ways than what they experienced in Oklahoma, though at least here there's no dust. The hostility from local Californians remains intense. Newspapers publish editorials demanding restrictions on migration. Local governments pass ordinances targeting migrant camps. Police regularly raid camps looking for excuses to arrest people or force them to move. The children experience bullying and discrimination when they manage to attend school. Being an Okie becomes an identity marker of poverty and unwantedness. But John also witnesses something remarkable. the growth of collective organization among migrants and agricultural workers. The labor camps, for all their hardship, become spaces of political education and organizing. People who never thought of themselves as workers, who identified as farmers and independent operators, begin to see themselves as part of a working class with common interests and the potential for collective power. In 1937, John participates in his first strike, walking out of cotton fields alongside hundreds of other workers demanding a wage increase from 40 cents to 60 cents per £100 picked. The strike is partially successful. The growers offer 50 cents rather than give in completely. More importantly, John experiences the power of collective action, the sense that together workers can challenge even powerful agricultural corporations. Mary becomes involved in camp organizing among women. They create collective kitchens to save resources and labor. They organize collective childcare cooperatives. They pressure camp management for better sanitation and water access. They advocate for access to schools for their children. This organizing isn't explicitly political, but it builds skills and solidarity that connect to broader movements. The children, now approaching school age, need stability and education that migrant life can't provide. John and Mary make a difficult decision. They'll try to save enough money to stop migrating, to settle in one place, to get regular work rather than following crops. It takes nearly 2 years of brutal saving, but by late 1938, they've accumulated enough to rent a small house in a town on the edge of agricultural country. John finds regular work with a farmer who needs a full-time employee rather than seasonal migrants. The wage is still low, but it's steady. Mary takes in laundry and sewing, using the skills she developed on the farm to earn small amounts of money. The children start attending school regularly, finally getting the education that's been interrupted for years. They're behind their classmates and still face discrimination, but they're learning. Life remains hard, but it's stable in ways it hasn't been since they left Oklahoma. They have a house instead of a tent. They're part of a community rather than temporary migrants. They can plan beyond the next week or month. This stability, modest as it is, feels like prosperity compared to the camps. By 1939, news from Oklahoma brings mixed emotions. The rains have returned. The worst of the drought has broken. The dust storms, while not completely ended, have decreased in frequency and intensity. The government's soil conservation programs are starting to show results. Some migrants are returning, reclaiming abandoned farms, starting over. John and Mary discuss whether they should return. The farm, abandoned when they left, has likely been taken for unpaid taxes or absorbed by neighbors. They have no claim to the land anymore. But beyond that, they're not sure they want to return. The trauma of the Dust Bowl years remains vivid. The farm represents grief and failure as much as it represents home and heritage. And they've built a life in California, difficult as it is. They decide to stay. California is home now, for better and worse. They're Californians, whether the old-timer residents accept them or not. The children are growing up here, making friends, becoming part of communities. John and Mary themselves have changed. They're not the naive farmers they were in 1932. They've experienced migration, poverty, discrimination, and collective organizing. They're part of something larger now, part of the movement for agricultural workers' rights, part of the community of displaced people making new lives. The late 1930s also bring wider political and social changes. The New Deal programs, which many Dust Bowl migrants benefit from, create a minimal safety net.
The Farm Security Administration establishes sanitary camps for migrant workers, provides loans for farmers to purchase land, and funds rural rehabilitation programs. These programs are imperfect and inadequate, but they represent recognition that the government has some responsibility to help people in crisis. World War II, beginning in Europe in 1939 and eventually involving the United States in 1941, transforms the economic landscape. Defense industries need workers. Agricultural production increases to support the war effort, creating more stable work and better wages. Some migrants leave agricultural work entirely for factory jobs in cities. The extreme poverty and desperation of the mid-1930s begins to ease, though agricultural workers remain among the poorest Americans.
By the mid-1940s, John and Mary have achieved modest stability. John has steady work, sometimes in agriculture, sometimes in other labour. Mary works part-time, her health never fully recovered but manageable. Their children are teenagers now, Americans in every way, with only faint memories of Oklahoma and the dust storms. They'll graduate high school, something neither John nor Mary could do, and have opportunities their parents never imagined. Looking back on the Dust Bowl years, certain lessons seemed clear. The disaster wasn't natural, it was caused by human decisions. The aggressive ploughing of the Great Plains, the destruction of native ecosystems, the prioritization of short-term profit over long-term sustainability, these choices created the conditions for catastrophe. When the drought came, as droughts always do in that region, the land had no resilience, no capacity to endure. The Dust Bowl also revealed how environmental disasters disproportionately harmed the poor and powerless. Wealthy farmers with diverse operations, with resources to install irrigation, with the ability to leave land fallow, survived better. Small farmers like John's family, totally dependent on wheat, with no resources to adapt, were destroyed. The pattern repeats through history. Climate and environmental crises hit hardest those least responsible for causing them and least able to survive them. The migration experience taught John and Mary about solidarity and collective action. The mutual aid in roadside camps, the organizing in migrant labor camps, the strikes and collective bargaining, these experiences of working-class solidarity were transformative. They learnt that survival in crisis requires cooperation, requires standing together, requires challenging power collectively. The hostility they experienced as migrants also taught lessons about how societies treat outsiders, about how quickly people become other when they're poor and displaced, about how fear and prejudice emerge in times of scarcity. The Oki experience parallels other migrations, other groups of displaced people seeking refuge and encountering hostility. It's a lesson about empathy, about recognizing shared humanity even across differences. The government's response to the Dust Bowl, slow and inadequate as it often was, demonstrated that collective action through democratic institutions can address crises that individuals and markets cannot solve. The soil conservation programs, the agricultural reforms, the migrant camps, the rural electrification, these government interventions helped regions recover, helped people survive, helped create the conditions for rebuilding. But the deeper lesson is about resilience, not just bouncing back, but fundamentally changing in response to crisis. The agricultural practices that led to the Dust Bowl couldn't simply resume once the rains returned. Sustainable farming required different approaches: crop rotation, maintaining native grasses as windbreaks, leaving some land fallow, adapting practices to the land's actual capacity rather than pushing for maximum short-term yield. John and Mary's children grow up with these lessons, though they may not articulate them explicitly. They understand that environments can collapse if mistreated. They understand that migration and displacement are sometimes necessary for survival. They understand that community and solidarity matter more than individual striving. They understand that the land must be respected, not just exploited. By the 1950s and 1960s, as California agriculture industrializes further, John and Mary are part of the older generation, the survivors, the ones who lived through the Dust Bowl and made it to the other side.
They tell their stories to grandchildren, trying to convey what it was like, what they endured, what they learned. The grandchildren, growing up in suburban comfort that their grandparents could never have imagined, listen politely but can't fully understand. How could they? The world has changed so much. But the lessons remain relevant. The Dust Bowl wasn't a one-time catastrophe safely in the past. It's a warning about what happens when human activities disrupt ecosystems beyond their capacity to recover, when short-term economic pressures override long-term sustainability, when we forget that we're dependent on natural systems we can damage but not control. John dies in 1964, at age 60. His health never fully recovered from the years of poverty and hardship. Mary lives into the 1970s, long enough to see the environmental movement emerge, to see a new awareness of ecological limits, to see her grandchildren become activists concerned about sustainability and environmental justice. She sees echoes of the Dust Bowl in new crises: water shortages in the West, soil depletion from industrial agriculture, climate change threatening disruption on a scale that might dwarf even the 1930s.
As you drift into sleep tonight, think about John and Mary and the hundreds of thousands like them who survived the Dust Bowl. Think about how they endured ecological catastrophe layered on top of economic collapse, how they maintained humanity and dignity in the face of suffering that would break many of us. The Dust Bowl teaches us that environmental disasters are rarely purely natural. They're shaped by human choices, by economic systems that prioritize short-term profit, by ignoring ecological limits until crisis forces recognition. It teaches us that disasters disproportionately harm those with least power and resources. And it teaches us that resilience requires not just individual toughness, but collective solidarity, mutual aid, and fundamental changes in how we live on the land. Every time you see news about drought, about climate refugees, about environmental collapse driving migration, remember the Dust Bowl. Remember that this has happened before, that people have survived catastrophe through solidarity and collective action, that rebuilding requires both individual resilience and systemic change. The farmers who survived the Dust Bowl didn't just wait for rain. They organized, migrated, built new communities, demanded government assistance, changed agricultural practices, and fundamentally transformed their relationship with the land. They showed that adaptation and resilience aren't passive but active, not individual but collective. As we face our own environmental crises, climate change, water scarcity, soil depletion, and ecosystem collapse, the Dust Bowl offers both warning and guidance. Warning about what happens when we ignore ecological limits. Guidance about how people can survive even catastrophic disruption through solidarity, mutual aid, and fundamental changes in how we live on the land. Sleep well, night wanderers. Rest knowing that humans have faced environmental catastrophes before and found ways to survive and rebuild. Rest knowing that resilience is not just individual toughness, but collective solidarity. Rest knowing that even the worst crises can be survived when people stand together. And remember John and Mary, farmers who lost everything, migrants who were scorned and rejected, survivors who built new lives from nothing, who maintained their dignity and humanity through disaster, who passed to their children and grandchildren the lessons of resilience, solidarity, and respect for the land. Their story isn't boring history, it's a lesson in survival, in what it takes to endure when everything falls apart, in how collective action and mutual aid can sustain people through catastrophe. Sweet dreams, and remember, we're all dependent on ecosystems we can damage but must respect. The Dust Bowl reminds us what happens when we forget that lesson.
and how ordinary people can survive even when the land itself seems to turn against them. Rest well